right, welcome everybody to the Leadership Development Office radio show and podcast. We're calling this Leadership in Practice because we want to tap into our colleagues' experience with different topics. Today's topic is productivity and more specifically around meeting management. I am Matthew Painter. I'll be your host today, joined by our very capable co-host, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Heider. I'm a senior consultant for leadership development in the Leadership Development Office. And we are joined today by two marvelous guests. And I'm going to go ahead and ask them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about themselves. LaKisha, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, happy to. Hello, everyone. My name is LaKisha Mack. I am the Senior Associate Dean for Finance and Administration in the medical school. Primarily work with finance or anything finance, budget, human resources, facilities, and compliance.
Fantastic.
I'm Erin Yarbrough. I'm one of the Associate Vice Presidents for Clinical Operations, working within the hospital, but I spend most of my time as kind of the liaison between hospital operations and any number of physician groups. So working with the hospital medicine program, the graduate medical education department, and then I oversee professional services agreements between the hospital and the academic departments. And then I work very closely with the accountable care teams.
Thank you all for sharing. Obviously, both of you have like a lot of experience in managing and with meetings and so forth. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to tap into your experience. Before we get into specifically around meeting management, I'm just curious if you reflect on your career and the lessons that you've learned, is there something that you would like to share in terms of just a leadership lesson learned that you think is important for people to learn as they grow in their organization?
Yeah, sure. I can actually take that one first. I think if I had to think about sort of the top three lessons that I've learned in the 21 years, certainly that I've been here at this university, I think first is just be authentic. It's important to let others know where you stand on issues, and so that there's no sort of ambiguity for the folks that you're working with to, again, just to let them know expectations. I think the second thing for me is put people first. If your team knows that you care, certainly not only about them, but the value that you value their ideas and their opinions, I think they're more inclined to put forth their best work and be a real key contributor to the team overall. And I think the last thing that I can think of in terms of leadership lessons learned is communicate, 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 communicate. There's just no such thing as under communicating. I think I've been in situations where, I thought that I've communicated well. And I think, I think it was Dr. Landfield that have said, one hasn't heard something until you've said it 7 times. And so I've taken that on as a leader in the school.
Excellent.
And if I can just say ditto to all of those, they're wonderful. And when I reflect on how I want to be at UAB, but then also professionally, I think that I've kind of molded the work that I do really around a few things. So one is I want people to always feel like their interactions with me made them feel better, like they got something out of it that they could take and move proactively. And then there's a real huge power to not feeling like you have to get credit for the work you do. Because at the end of the day, as long as good things happen around you, then people are going to know that you had a part to play. And there's no shortage of things that can happen if you let other people take credit, because that's what motivates people and empowers them. And then finally, adaptability, I think, is the biggest name of the game, especially in an organization like this, where we're always kind of subject to changes at the state level, at the national level, both within and outside our organization's control. But as long as we can move nimbly and, to LaKisha's point, communicate effectively why we're doing what we're doing, and yes, it might mean a shift, you're always going to end up on the better foot.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all. Those are absolutely fantastic. So thank you all for sharing that. That's one of the beauties of doing this and having these conversations, is we get to capture that, and other people can learn and be challenged by their own leadership practice. I think a lot of the things that you all mentioned are often encapsulated or are manifested when we communicate, and sometimes when we communicate, that's often in the form of a meeting, right? So sometimes our leadership is on display when we have meetings with other people, whether they're formal or informal. So I'm just going to ask you to think about, like, in general, like, what's your approach or your philosophy towards meetings?
So I think for me, it's determining if the meeting is first informational or decision making. I think that this alleviates membership from being random. And then oftentimes, most of us tend to think in categories of people. More importantly, though, it should be categories of information. So I think participation should be driven by the mission. And so what needs to be done determines who needs to be at the meeting. I think also, all decision groups need to establish their purpose with a charter. I think the charter spells out the intent, it spells out the goals, and certainly the contributions to the mission. And I think lastly, I think just sharing agendas, certainly probably ahead of time so people can understand, sort of the expectation of the meeting.
Excellent.
And I think I'll piggyback on that. When I think about meetings, and I know that meetings get a lot of bad rap, especially from frontline clinicians, because I definitely understand that a lot of things could have been an email when instead we have a meeting. But I also think there's a really big power to having a certain group of people together to hear each other saying the things that that they're all saying kind of behind closed doors. Progress, in my opinion, doesn't happen without that. So I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out, what do I want to accomplish from a meeting? And all the people that I need on board, where do they each stand? And if I don't know where they stand, then I probably need to have a conversation so that I can figure out what's motivating them, what's important to them. And then I can find a way in that meeting to have it come up organically in a non-threatening way, laying it all out on the table, so that then you can come to resolution. So sometimes you definitely need meetings to result in action and decision, but you're going to spend a lot of time trying to get to that point. And that's okay.
So to piggyback off that a little bit, can you talk about how you boost engagement in a meeting setting? Because meetings aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily carry the same connotation to everyone. Some people don't interact at their best or offer their best thoughts during a meeting. How do you guarantee that everyone gets engaged and is participating at the level that you need them to?
I'd say first, there's no guarantee. I mean, sometimes you're just not going to be able to get that participation until people feel like there's a personal reason for them to engage, and that's okay. I think there's a lot to be said for always coming together and stating the why. Even if you feel like you've said it multiple times, as LaKisha said, people have to hear it over and over again. This is why we're together. Let me give you a reminder of what we decided last time. This is where we are today. Here's the action that's taken place between then and now. That then kind of gets everybody's head in the game, rather than this is just a one meeting that I have to go to, either in a series of meetings, or it's my one meeting of the day and I'm busy seeing many different patients and I've got all these other demands for my priorities. But stating the why, I think you can never underestimate the importance of that.
Now, I would completely agree with everything Erin just said. I think it's important to state expectations so that people are clear, and so they can understand, why they're there, and certainly what they can contribute to the discussion.
Do you often find yourselves like, how have you engaged the audience? Like maybe some people aren't participating. Do you just let that go, or do you find a way to engage them? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I like to be able to create a platform where people can feel comfortable with contributing to the discussion. They were invited because they have something to contribute. So I make sure that I articulate that to them and that they understand that they do have something to their ideas are important. So that's the first thing that I do. And I think the second thing is it's being open, being flexible, that, perhaps maybe, the topic on the table at that time might not be something that everyone might have an opinion on. And again, I think that's okay. It's being able to be flexible, and, certainly allow people to understand and be clear that they were brought to the table because we believe that they do have something to contribute.
I think there's a lot of reading emotion and body language that you have to do too. So, I mean, as LaKisha said, a lot of times people will check out for a moment of the discussion just because it doesn't pertain to them. That's fine. And especially in the age of Zoom meetings, it's wonderful because if something's being discussed and you don't need to weigh in, you can answer email, but then you can clue right back when you're needing to engage. But I mean, if you as a meeting facilitator can pick up on when people are disengaging because they're upset about the direction of the conversation, they feel like they're not getting a chance to speak, you can use hopefully your knowledge of the relationship to decide, is this a moment when I need to call out that person especially and say, hey, here's your opportunity to speak. I mean, how do you feel about this? Sometimes people appreciate that, but you also have to be aware that it might put people on the spot. So if there's at all the chance that that's going to put people on the spot, hold it. Maybe shoot them a private text or email and say, hey, I noticed you kind of shut down halfway through the meeting. Tell me what that was about. I'd really like to make sure I understand and can help support you next time. And most of the time people respond positively.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Erin. I just, as of last week, I did that exact same thing. There was a Zoom call, and I noticed that one person on the meeting, and it was a small group, but one person, probably 45 minutes in, just did not say anything. And so just in the chat, I privately, sent him a message and said, hey, are you okay? I noticed that you're pretty quiet. You were invited to this meeting because I know that you have so much to contribute. And he sent a note back and said, I'm just trying to figure out how to insert my idea. And so that was really good to know that. And so, by me being the facilitator of the meeting, I knew that he was comfortable enough to be able to share his ideas. So I said, okay, let's just pause. Jimmy, I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas about this topic. And that allowed him to be able to, freely share his ideas.
Well, I guess Zoom kind of gives some unique opportunities for that because you've got the private chat option, right?
That's right. That's absolutely right.
So I'm curious, I'd love to hear stories if you've got them. What was your worst or your best experience facilitating a meeting? Or one of each?
So, I think for me, I am a very structured individual. I can't think of anything that's any worse. Any meetings that I facilitated, but that's just me. I'm sure others will probably disagree with that. But I think it's important to be prepared. And so I really tried to have a real structured, organized agenda meeting. And it's funny because, I lead a group of probably 60 individuals that are executive administrators in the school. And we have weekly meetings. And it's funny because, there's this ongoing sort of joke that the meeting starts at 10 and, oh my gosh, if it starts at 10:01, then, it's sort of a big deal. LaKisha really believes in starting meetings on time. And so, I think that, again, just that setting expectation that, it's okay to be late, but then also know that, if it's something that, LaKisha is leading, then you can pretty much guess that it's going to start on time. So again, just, clarifying, sort of why we're meeting, developing a structure that make decision-making possible to accomplish. And then just articulate everyone has to know his or her role in order to achieve the goal.
And I would say starting meetings on time, respecting people's time constraints is very important. I'm sure people are going to disagree with me, but for the most part, I'm kind of a believer that there is no meeting that's wasted. Unless people show up and it's unclear why we're here, no one really knows what they want to get out of the meeting, we're kind of talking around in circles and then no one leaves with an action item, that is a bad meeting. I hope that I've never been a part of one of those meetings, because usually I even feel personally responsible to say, even if it's not my meeting, to say, so why are we here? What do we think the issues are? And kind of drive people towards coming up with action items. But let's just say that you go into a meeting and you expect to be talking about X, and then no one can get off of Y, and we keep talking about Y. Well, they're doing that for a reason. And I think that discussion is very helpful. In some cases, it might set you back a week or, a day or however much. But you end up figuring out a little bit more about the players, what's important to them, and then it helps you plan better for the next meeting.
So that's interesting that you take that perspective, Erin. I think that I probably differ a little bit in that I tend to, I think it's called agenda integrity. And so I try to ensure that all items on the agenda are discussed for which that they are scheduled. And then items that are not on the agenda are certainly important, but in order to be able to achieve the stated goals for which we're trying to accomplish, because meetings are only, 30, 45 minutes to an hour long. And so if those who have, sort of ideas and other things that they want to talk about, then I certainly make sure that I acknowledge that, but then also sort of carve out a different time in order for us to be able to achieve that.
That's a great point, LaKisha. I think that needed to be said, is that if you have a rigid agenda and you've got to tick off 5 items, which we all know those types of meetings, you can say, okay, I can tell the discussion needs to continue. I'll make sure that we get a chance to discuss that later.
So all of you have been sort of, we've captured a lot of tips, takeaways already. But in terms, if you just think about what success factors are involved in meetings, some of you alluded to like ground rules and so forth. So I'm just curious, do you all publish ground rules ahead of time, or do you start with those? And what other success factors have we not captured thus far?
Right. I speaking personally, I can tell you that I have been to a lot of meetings where it felt like the meeting was the opposite of getting work done. And so how do you avoid that? I'm fascinated to see how that plays out for you.
So I think certainly through this pandemic, now that all meetings have been mostly virtual, people are navigating. I think we've all now gotten accustomed to Zoom, but at the very beginning, people were trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? So I think in my meetings, certainly that I've led, and especially if, you have meetings with 50, 60, and 70 people on the call, it's important to lay out what those ground rules are, right? So, what are, how do you navigate the functionalities of Zoom? How do you raise your hand? Because raising your hand is very important in lieu of just, spitting out your comment, right? To create some structure around expectations of the meeting. And so I think everyone now gets it because we're 8 months in. But at the very beginning, it was very clear, or at least very important for me to lay out those ground rules. How do you share your ideas? Use the chat function because that's very important. And we will acknowledge what you put in the chat. So those are some of the ground rules that I've been able, and it's been quite successful. We've been able to maintain within the allotted time of that meeting, but then it also allowed people to be able to share their ideas in a structured format.
Those are all great ground rules. And I'll just talk about the content for me. So if it's a meeting that I've pulled together, that I'm like, the invite comes from me and I'm responsible for the agenda, then I always start with, where did we end up last time? What action has taken place between then and now? And then I always end on, okay, who's doing what? I think that, it sounds really simple, but sometimes it's really easy to get up from a meeting and everybody walks away and no one knows who's doing what. And then that is definitely a wasted meeting. So as long as you're clear on who's doing, sometimes depending upon the audience, you get to know the feel of the group. If it's mentioned one time and then that everybody who's in that discussion is going to know what's expected of them and they're going to go do it, great. You don't have to do anything else. But a lot of times you need a follow-up email to say, okay, Erin agreed she was going to do such and such. LaKisha's going to work on this. She's going to get back to Erin and we'll revise an agenda. And those things are very helpful to people because I think a lot of times people can get lost in the discussion. It still swirls in their mind as they move on. And unless you have very clear action items, then it gets fuzzy for people.
Thank you for sharing that, because I know some of the meetings I've been to, I think what you're talking about is really context. And I know that we have so many meetings all the time. By the time we get into a new meeting where it's like, okay, what are we doing? Why are we meeting? And like, what did we accomplish last time? So I really appreciate the fact that you're kind of drawing lines and creating that context for us to move forward. That's really helpful.
Yeah, these are really great tips and really great insights. So if someone was going into facilitating a meeting for the first time, this is their first experience as a meeting facilitator, what advice would you give them?
Again, I think it's, I think it's much of what we talked about before. It's, I think it's important to prepare. I think that's the very first step. I think defining the purpose of the meeting. Again, otherwise you allow individuals to define it themselves. right? And this creates focus and intentionality. And I think just, clarification about what we are doing in each part of the meeting, i.e. an agenda. I read John Trotman's book. There are probably 1,000 books out there about effective meetings. And I've read his book, and again, he talks about agenda integrity, and to ensure that all items on the agenda are discussed. And those that are not, there's another forum for that. Again, developing a structure that makes decision-making possible to accomplish. And then just to ensure that everyone knows what their role is, to ensure that, that everyone achieves the goal. I think, Erin brings up a really good point in many of the things that she said. So I would absolutely agree.
And then I would say, agree on that. But then for somebody who's walking in, and it really depends on the type of people that you're facilitating a meeting with and the type of how their days are structured. If they're busy clinicians, then this is probably the one meeting, and then you're going to deal with it differently. And the types of things you're going to discuss are going to be different than if you're, leading a group of 60 people like LaKisha is. For LaKisha, I know developing agenda takes months in advance sometimes, and a lot of things have to happen before you can even get to a point of agreeing. You got to make sure that every person who might need to know that this is going to be on the agenda actually gets the chance to see that it's on the agenda. Versus if it's a group of people and you really have relative control over what you're discussing, just insulated in that group. And then, you might need to just say, hey, maybe I need to touch base with a couple of people just to make sure that they know what we're going to discuss. And if there's any pre-work they need to do, they get the chance. I always say that preparing for a meeting, you probably really need to think, what is the purpose, as LaKisha said? And if you don't have all of the background information done so that you can get that group to understand what the purpose is and what needs to move forward, then you probably really need to think about what kind of action. So you need to give yourself enough time, at least a week, to make sure that you've met with the right people ahead of time, that you pulled the right data ahead of time, so that when you actually show up, you're not talking about the things you need to do, you're talking about the things you have done.
Yeah.
So I have a question that's kind of related to that then. So it seems like it's pretty easy to get sidetracked from agenda integrity, and you're mentioning this as being important. So if you have a situation where it's difficult to maintain agenda integrity, people have a lot of things that are on their mind that they want to bring up that aren't necessarily on the agenda or that you don't see as relevant. What advice do you give to somebody who needs to redirect and get back on course when there are maybe strong emotions tied up with the rabbit hole that everyone's going down?
Yeah, no, it's happened more than a dozen times for sure, Laura. And it's a really good question. Again, I think it's important to acknowledge that person who brought that topic up. Certainly they feel like it's important enough for them to bring it up at that very moment. And it's important for me to acknowledge that. And so for me, it's, hey, John, thank you so much for your thoughts. That's an excellent idea. In order for us to be able to maintain within the time that we're allotted, let's take that offline. In fact, many times what I'll do is I'll send them a direct email before the call ends and say, hey, let me get my assistant to set them up for us to talk about this. And then if it's important for us to include it on the next meeting's agenda, it's added with no problem.
I have nothing to add.
I'm sure it can be difficult and challenging to deal with people bringing strong emotions to the table about meeting items.
Yes.
I'm curious if you all, LaKisha, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we are now doing a lot more remotely and virtual meetings and so forth. So I'm just curious if you have any advice around just hosting a virtual meeting.
Again, I think I am a proponent of agenda setting. I've said this over and over and over again. I think it's important for people to understand what to expect. I think be careful with long presentations, right? PowerPoint presentations. I think folks get, it's sort of a license to multitask. And that's probably okay to some degree, but you want to ensure that your folks' attention to the topic at hand. And again, just setting clear objectives, setting the ground rules, and clearly outlining next steps after the virtual meeting.
And now, I think the biggest drawback from virtual meetings is that people do have the ability to turn off their camera or not even have it on in the first place. And you have no idea whether that person's in the room paying attention. So I always make a point to very rarely turn off my video. And if I do, I try and let people know why I'm doing it and what I expect the time, that I'm going to be gone will look like. I think I had a meeting with Laura and Matthew where I had to do that. It was unexpected. But really try and show that I respect the fact that I need to be an active participant in this meeting. And then other people see that that's kind of how I respond to emails, to meetings, and then they, structure their work in that same way. And then if people, let's say, aren't showing their video, I usually try and actively call for them to participate. So, LaKisha, I haven't heard from you, are you getting what we're talking about? Is this really needing, do you have the chance to voice in what you're thinking? A lot of times you'll find that they are not really clued in. That's great. That gives you a chance to say, hey, next time we're going to be talking about stuff and we need to make decisions. Your voice is very important. But then a lot of times people just don't feel comfortable showing their, it I think took us all outside of the comfort zone for a little bit. These two folks are very good at backgrounds, and they figured out how to make it work. And some of us were less tech savvy and still struggle. But I think that that's been my biggest challenge in facilitating meetings, is when people don't show their video, and all you have to do is actively pull them out and engage.
No, that's a really good point, Erin. I think for my team, I sort of set that expectation. I think you're absolutely right. Working from home, people are quite comfortable. I think that I've even had a couple people on my team said that they haven't showered like the first couple days or brushed their teeth the first couple days of this pandemic. And so they didn't want to show their face. And so it's like, okay, so let's sort of lay the ground rules here. It's important to shower, even if you're, working from home. But then, again, just it's important to see your face. It's important to know that you're engaged. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think showing the video is really critical.
So I have a question. Part of meeting management, obviously, is what happens next. So both of you have I know how to talk. Both of you have mentioned that it's really important to have action steps moving forward when you're concluding a meeting. How do you ensure that those action steps are followed up on and that sort of thing gets fulfilled?
Yeah, so, I try to, as Erin described, just be very clear in terms of before you leave the meeting, make sure that you reiterate what the action items are. And if there is someone who's leading that endeavor, hey, Laura, I understand that this is what you will do. And then I also follow up with an email. I try to keep part of my holding myself accountable is I put reminders on my calendar to remind other people about what their action items are. And so that way, the next time we get together for a meeting, we won't be having the same conversation again, right? So we're actually moving this along. So that's sort of my trick on, how do I keep that going?
I do the same thing, LaKisha. I always say that if it's my meeting that I called, then I feel responsible for there having been progress. So even if the person who's going to do X, Y, or Z doesn't report to me, I feel responsible for making sure that they show up to the next meeting with their work done. But part of that too is just out of respect for them. I never want them to show up and feel on the spot. Maybe I have to make sure that they understood what the purpose of the action was, that I get a chance to be a support to them to clarify if they need it. But I also never want people to feel like, well, they keep coming to meetings that Erin called and they keep discussing the same old. That's, even if it's not my responsibility, I kind of take personal ownership for it.
So this topic today is really kind of under the umbrella of productivity. It's all under leadership, but then there's this idea of productivity. So I'm curious to know, like, in terms of scheduling meetings and being productive, how do you approach those things? Any thoughts?
Scheduling meetings and being productive.
Yeah, maybe clarify.
Yeah.
So, like, do you have a philosophy on like how often you meet, for how long? How do you manage your calendar? Just some general tips or thoughts around, people's time, your time, how to make it work?
Yeah, so I think for me, each morning prioritizing the top 3 tasks to accomplish for the day. This allows me to focus on tasks that are important and not those that are urgent. For me personally, I've learned to say no. And, because there are so many different, there could be so many different people pulling you in different directions. In order for me to be productive, sometimes you just got to say no. And if it's your boss that's asking you to do these things, I ask he or she, tell me what's priority for you. I've got these 5 things that you've asked me to do. You tell me, what's important for you in order for me to be able to accomplish what you've set out. And I think for me, just scheduling desk time, that's very, very important. So, we're all really busy. Most of us are on Zoom calls 8 to 12 hours a day. So the question is when in the world do we get work done? And I have to set time aside to not only think strategically, but to actually get work done. So oftentimes than not, I absolutely have my assistant block my calendar. It is a non-negotiable, unless it's an urgent matter, that time slot gets filled with a meeting. And then pre-COVID, I set time away, maybe at a Starbucks or, a bookstore away from campus so that folks won't interrupt my strategic thinking time.
That's great.
LaKisha and I actually work very similarly. I'm the same way. I have to structure time for me to just sit down and respond to emails, because you can be in Zooms all day, and then by the time you emerge, you are completely underwater, and then people start waiting on you for making things move. The one thing that I'll say is, as my role at UAB has shifted, I used to rely so much more on desk time to actually get things done. I've almost gotten to a point where I can't rely on that as much, and I know LaKisha can't either. It's very hard to get desk time when so many people need your participation. So I've had to shift my thinking of what my role is, and it's about less doing and more influencing and discussion, and kind of getting people to kind of go on the journey with you. So a lot of times the amount of work that I do on email has to happen kind of in those Zoom meetings where I've talked about, where it's okay for you to check out for a second, respond to 3 emails real fast, and then file it away. So I think Zoom has been really advantageous for a lot of us, because we've learned how to, I feel more productive than I was before, honestly. I'm not having to walk all the way across campus multiple times a day for all of my meetings. I'm able to schedule them back to back. You're not spending time figuring out where you're going to meet and all this stuff. And it gives you the chance to kind of stay on top of email for those times where you're not getting reliable desk time like you need. But I will say that LaKisha's strategy is one that I employed too, where sometimes you just need to shut down for 3 hours and knock stuff out. And you have to make sure that you're, that message to your folks who need you is clear, that this is my time where I really got to get some work done.
Absolutely fantastic.
So Laura, do you have anything else that you want to dive into?
I think this was phenomenal. You all have such terrific insight on how to really get the most out of meetings, which for me, that's always been a difficulty, because setting aside the time and then making sure that it fulfills the purpose, instead of just being an hour out of your day that you don't have or you can't afford. That's such a tricky line to walk, and you have managed it effectively, and I have nothing but respect for that.
Thank you. No, this has been a great discussion. I think I've learned, as long as I've known Erin, I didn't realize how much we were cut from the same cloth. And I welcome the opportunity to participate in any meeting that you might have, Erin, because I know that it will be productive.
Yes, thank you both for joining us again and letting us tap into your leadership experience. And thank you all for joining us on the Leadership Development Office radio show and podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.